Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you, and welcome to Islam and Life with me, Tariq Ramadan, broadcasting from London. In today's show, we will talk about the hardening of attitudes towards Muslims in the West.
The disadvantaged position of Muslim minorities, the rise of Islamophobia, and increasing alienation and radicalization have triggered an intense debate in the European Union regarding the need to re-examine community cohesion and integration policies. A report by the European Monitoring Centre on Racism and Xenophobia documents findings in the areas of employment, education and housing. It has found that feelings of exclusion are more marked amongst European-born Muslims in comparison with their parents. It notes that respondents in Denmark, Germany, France, the Netherlands and the UK reported that policies and public discourse in the last 5 years have negatively impacted on their sense of belonging. In the experience of some respondents, even those who had previously felt part of society, increasing alienation and rejection was felt. Islam and Life will investigate what the root causes are of this general discrimination and Islamophobia within the European Union and how Muslims should deal with it.
These are important questions indeed. One would have expected after 2 generations of Muslim presence in Europe or in the States or in other Western countries that the situation would improve. It's exactly the opposite that we are witnessing today. Islamophobia is everywhere. The negative image of Islam is something that we all can see everywhere in European countries. It's now the case in the States. We hear this in Australia as well. The situation is quite bad. So Islam is portrayed as the religion of the other. It's the religion of the foreigners. It's not the Western religion. And more importantly, when it comes to job market, when it comes to education, when it comes to housing, Muslims are facing discriminations. One has to ask oneself why this is the situation, what is happening in the West, and why Islam is portrayed in such a negative perception and such a negative representation in the media, but also among our fellow citizens in the West. So many questions. And to answer these questions, I'm joined by Dr. Salman Said, who is a political theorist from the University of South Australia. Thank you so much for being with us today. As we have seen in the clip, and the figures are worrying, the situation of Muslims, Western Muslims, in all the countries. Now it's something that we can, somewhat saying, no, it's only in Europe, but we have seen over the last few months that in the States is exactly the same. And in Australia, even in New Zealand, we have, discourses that are quite negative. You have to think about a historical experience. Someone would have expected that the situation would improve, and it's not improving. Why do you think that the situation is so negative and so difficult today?
I think one of the things we have to understand that this is not just a recent phenomenon. It's not even to do with the war and terror, which of course has helped accelerate some of these processes. I think more generally the problem really starts from the fact that as Muslims become more conscious of being Muslims, it has created lots of difficulties for Western societies. Partly because the narrative...
Can you explain this before going further? Okay. What does it mean, becoming aware of being Muslim?
I think because previously, if you think about, let's look at Europe, you had Pakistanis, you had Bangladeshis, you had Algerians, people from Maghreb, you had Kurds and you had Turks, but you didn't have Muslims. Publicly, previously. Yeah. Now, at some point, around about the late 80s, in Britain you can date it more or less to the 89, with the Rushdie affair, you have the emergence of something called Muslim, which transcended these kind of local, national, ethnic affiliations. Part of that has been helped by the process of European unification anyway. So what you have then in common now, for example, is Muslims which exist in France, in Germany, in Britain, etc., rather than Kurds and Turks in Germany and this. And this has been a process both from the grassroots among Muslims themselves, because I think it's been part of a general awakening, Muslim awakening throughout the Ummah, which I think everyone is aware of now. If you look at our parents' generation and their parents' generation, and you look at things like attendance at mosque, you look at all kinds of ways, Muslims are much more conscious of being Muslim. And that's also happened in the West. So the narrative that they had, that eventually, you start off with the first generation, which is very traditional, the second generation less traditional, the third generation will be, so there's a process of assimilation each generation.
Dis-Islamization in practice,
And this has completely been thrown open. I mean, in fact, what you see is almost like you said, the reverse. So that narrative about slow, gradual assimilation it's just been erupted by Muslims.
But there is something interesting in what you are saying, is that what we heard, and when I hear, for example, in many councils, for example, at the European level, and among politicians in the West, the perception is that something's changed in fact, the European minds and perceptions, saying, yesterday we were talking about Pakistani, we were talking about Turkish, or about Arabs, and now we are talking about they are all Muslims. So it's a transnational threat to the European identity. What you are saying is the opposite. In fact, it's not coming from the perception of the West, it's coming from the self-definition of the Muslims.
I think that both processes are going together, because I think this is very important to recognize that what we Muslims do have impact on other people perceive us, but we're not necessarily responsible for their impact. So I think one of the things we have to understand is that Muslims themselves have gone through historical changes and transformations. Take something like in the 1960s, when you had governments in Muslim countries, and in Tunisia, for example, willing to say, well, we should ban fasting during the month of Ramadan.
This was Bourguiba's
thing. Yeah. Now, tell me something. Do you really think anywhere in the Muslim world right now, any government of any shape would be willing to make that statement? It's just not. It's impossible to. So something has happened, and we can't forget that. And I think it's important to recognize that the Iranian Revolution, the revolution in Iran, many mobilizations. So you can actually see the narrative of what are the developments which have been going on in the Ummah,
so
which are separate.
It's a two-way process from within the Muslim communities in the West, and also the perceptions. Now, okay, this is something which is more aware that we are Muslims, or European Muslims, or Western Muslims, and
all
so
Muslims.
Why? Sorry?
All Muslims.
All Muslims, just. Okay, I don't have a problem with this, understanding that Islam is Islam, but we can have a Western cultures, and then there is no problem with this. The main point for me is, so with this, why this new awareness is creating, or could have as an impact, or as a consequence, such a negative perception coming from
But that's, I think, where the second part of the equation comes in, and I think partly to do with this. Look at the countries in which there have been sort of major panics about the Muslim presence initially. You look at Netherlands, you look at France, you look at Britain. Germany more recently. But if you look at all of these countries, there is a sense in which the notion of pan-Europeanness, which is because of the European Union, has also meant a threat to national identities. It's more, what does it mean to be Dutch in a world of the European Union? What does it mean to be French in a world of the European Union? So in a sense, I mean, this is why I think the whole debate about the burqa is really extraordinary. Now, as you know, Tariq, and everyone has commented about it, the number of women wearing the burqa in France, in Netherlands, is minuscule. Let me give you an example from Adelaide, the city there. A city of 1 million in Australia. The city of 1 million people. There is an attempt there to ban the burqa. Now, so far, people have worked out that maybe 12 women who may wear the burqa in a city of 1 million in Adelaide. Why? I mean, it is a monumental waste of time for a legislator for all kinds of reasons. So it's not really about the burqa. And the reasons when people ask you why you want to do it, it says, oh, there was a bank robbery committed in a bank when someone wore a burqa and carried out a bank robbery.
Yes. So, but this is the main, this is exactly the point. I'm just coming back from the States. In the States, we have 18 states now in the United States of America. They want to ban Sharia. And in some of these states, there is almost no Muslims. There is just unbelievable. But still it's there. So this is a pretext. This is not the heart, the core of the question.
But it's more than a pretext, because if you look at, for example, the history of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism is virulent in Japan when there's hardly historically or even physically a significant Jewish community. It's not the presence of Jews that make people anti-Semites, and I don't think it's the presence of Muslims anymore which makes people Islamophobia. This is the argument people always use against immigrants, is that immigration causes racism. We have to limit the number of immigrants. Muslims cause Islamophobia, so if we limit the number of Muslims or people
will change, and this is not the case.
Then we won't.
So come to the point now. How do you explain that? So how do you explain, for example, that in Australia, in some of the villages, they are now so much against Islam and Muslims, while they have no Muslims living there? So how do you explain that?
I think the narrative here is really comes down to the question about Western identity. And this is why I think there are two things that we have to separate. The problems on politics of Muslim identification, which is something that I think is really for the Muslim Ummah to sort out itself, and the problems of the West. And these things are linked for historical and contingent reasons. So what has happened subsequently is that the idea of the West has now become an idea of distancing oneself from Islam. Now this is seen, for example, homophobes can become gay-friendly in relation to Muslims. Islam was condemned.
New alliances against the...
But not just alliances, but their perception.
Yes.
Even if you're the most misogynist Western male, you can always say you're much more feminist than Islam because it's patriarchal. So Islam is always the counter-narrative, the counter-intuitively what you want to be. The best of you is always reflected in the worst of Islam, whether that's got anything to do with Muslims or not. I have been at meetings here among leading anti-race organizations, I won't mention any names, who mentioned that the biggest problem in the UK among Muslims was polygamy. And as someone pointed out that, they've been living here 30 years, they hardly know any significant polygamous. I mean, I'm sure there are people, but that's not the major issue.
Yeah.
If you go and ask Muslims what the major issue is, they will not say that. If you ask Muslim women what the major issue in their lives is, the hijab will not come up as a major issue for them. Most Muslim women will not. They wear, they don't wear. I mean,
it's not a problem.
It's not a problem for them. It's not our problem. It's their problem in a sense. And so I think we are dealing with them. There's a town in Canada, you probably heard about this, which has banned stoning for adultery. Now, no one was trying to stone anyone for adultery. There was no case. There was no reason for what is the idea of a preemptive ban, just in case. So a lot of this crisis of multiculturalism...
So would you say that upstream from all this discussion about the Muslim presence and this Islam as being the religion of the other is in fact just a way to create from within the society a new way to a new narrative, our nation, who we are as different, who we are not, and who we are not other Muslims.
Yeah, I think that's partly it. I mean, if you think about what's happened with Obama, how much he's been accused of being a crypto-Muslim. And there was a scene, I don't know if you saw this, where this woman came up to the Tea Party saying, I want my country back. Now, leaving...
And he's now...
He's the president, he was the president of the United States. So the idea that Muslims are actually... On the body of Muslims, you're inscribing the decline of the West in its position in the world. And that's all the attacks on multiculturalism, all the attacks on Muslims come down to this central narrative. Once upon a time, Europe, the West, however you want to call it, was the center of the planet. It was unquestionably the center of the planet. And the fact is that the Muslims are the largest significant population which no longer takes seriously the claims of Western superiority. Because every day they're reminded of its limits constantly. Partly
when it comes to the values, to the rights, to the values,
equality. If you want to ask Muslims, the values are like T-shirt slogans. They're not practices. You can't have. You have the rule of law. They talk about the rule of law, but in practice you see many other things. Guantanamo is a very good example of that. It's not that when you criticize what happened in Guantanamo, what's happening in Guantanamo. The argument is always made, well, Saddam is worse, or the Syrians were worse, or whoever the Muslim dictatorships are worse. But that's not the claim that the West ever made. The claim was never that we are better than the Ba'athist murderers, we are better than the torturers in there. It was that we are better. And the point is that Muslims are constantly being reminded. In that sense, the experience...
So they can witness firsthand that there is a contradiction.
And in that sense, the Muslim experience isn't that different from the African-American experience during the Civil Rights Movement, when what the claims were made for the American Constitution were belied in everyday practice. And it wasn't that you became politicized or conscious. You had no choice.
The problem is that I'm not sure that the Muslims themselves are aware that they are part of this historical experience. For example, even in the States today, you have the immigrants. Some of them are buying the American dream, while the African-American Muslims are saying, what are you talking about? It's not the point. This is not the point. The point in this country is about discrimination, it's about whiteness and blackness. It's a long history of discrimination, come to the values and the discrepancy between the two. So now if we want to go to solutions, because at the end of the day it's just what you are saying, and it's visible and it's understandable at the grassroots level. It's a revealing process. It's revealing not only how Islam is perceived, but also the self-perception of the West as to its position in the world, culturally, politically, economically speaking, and even in what is happening now in the Middle East. There is something which is a shift. it's clear. Yeah. Now, what should be the way forward? How could we move on to change this perception and to come to a better understanding, or at least a better implementation of the rules that we are and the values that we are claiming?
I think we should be very cautious as Muslim groups of being the therapist for the West. That's not our role. That's not, we can do that. What that means for us is that I think it's partly we have to give up on the project that if they knew more about us, they will necessarily love us more or they'll like us more, because that's not what it really is about. I think partly the educative
It's
element,
not about knowledge, mutual knowledge.
No,
it's about what? Power?
It's ultimately a degree of power, but it's nothing more than that. I think it's a question of that being able to say, look, you have your own problems, we have our own problems. We can meet halfway to try and sort them.
But who is this we and you? For example, if you talk to me and I'm saying, okay, look, I'm a Muslim, but I am a European. Am I right or am I wrong, according to your perception?
Well, I mean, I can have that conversation with you, but I mean, the thing is that...
No, but the point is, when you say you have your problem and you have ours,
no, I think,
as a European
I think
Muslim.
there's two things. There's two things here. I think, firstly, there is no doubt that you have to accept that there is something called Muslim, and that has a certain kind of singularity. For example, a lot of the times when you're criticized for making interventions which within the Muslim kind of heritage seem very kind of applicable, very important, etc. But then they're always considered to be appeasement or something like that for worse kinds of things, right? Because there's a sort of recognition, there's no recognition of the historicity of our own heritage in that sense. So being a Muslim means being part of a conversation with other Muslims who call themselves Muslims, and I leave it like that. Now, that doesn't mean that when you say to me, am I a European, you can also be part of a conversation about Europeans. But I don't think, for example, I'm not a Catholic, so I don't have I may have an opinion about the fallibility of the Pope, but it doesn't really have any significance. That is something for the Catholics community to sort out. Similarly, there are many issues about Muslims which I think can only be resolved conversations about Muslims. I can't take it very seriously with conversations which others have.
What about Muslims living in the West, that I call Western Muslims, dealing with a negative image and discrimination and Islamophobia? What should they do?
Well, there's very short answer.
It's not solving the problem of the other, it's solving their own problem.
This is what I think that our very short, and I think to some extent moves have already been made. And I think the main thing for us to do is to become more politically aware, to be more politically participatory, to be more mobilized. And those things have been happening. They're happening almost de facto because you're forced into this kind of compulsory consciousness. There is no, I mean, in Britain, and I don't know the situation of the societies, but the most active political societies and student unions, now one of them is the ISOC, Muslim Islamic societies all over. Partly is because the experience of being a Muslim, because it becomes harder because of the pressure, then you have to be quite firm and you have to think about it. You have to think about it much more. And Muslims are asked constantly to reflect upon themselves, to explain themselves. So we have almost this kind of process of creative rethinking going on. And I think that is something we need to encourage.
Yes, that's very important. The only problem here is that because of the pressure, as you said, this is pushing the Muslims to be much more active and sometimes creative in all the channels and the ways that they can find solutions. The problem is that very often, and we can see this in the States or in European countries or even in Australia, in that it's very much a reactive attitude. So we are on the defensive and we react. We are creative out of defensiveness. Is this the way forward?
I think that is true of Muslim minorities in the West. I don't think it's necessarily true of the Muslim Ummah. And one thing I think...
Yes, I'm talking about the West. Yes.
But I think those two things, I think it's important. One thing that I think we can do is not allow ourselves to be corralled into these kind of national spaces. I think that's very, very important. And one of the things...
To look beyond.
To look beyond that, because... And I think that is what gives us our strength and possibilities of transformation. What we are always being told is that we are minorities and we should behave as minorities. But when the roles that we're given for minorities is very, very limited. We should not have any say in in foreign policy. We should not be able to hold democratic governments accountable and take seriously their claims of democracy. I think we should do all of those things. But we should also remember that the question of whether you're a minority or majority depends how you do the counting. And I think that's important. So in a sense, for Muslims, I think there are two things that are really important. One, that we recognize that all these pressures are there, but we recognize that there is some sense of transnational conversations. I certainly think that's important. And I think secondly, for us to have the confidence to start articulating a better world for everyone, not just ourselves, but for everyone.
So a kind of a vision for
yes,
all.
Yes, a vision for all. I mean, say that, look, we do our things, you want to come with us, fine. And, we'll have that conversation. I think the trap for us is that we get caught up, like you said, being defensive and apologizing for what we are not, because that process will never end, and for constantly having to explain ourselves in things that we don't really are not that important to us.
But quite quickly, don't you think that if you have to assess the situation now, after 2 or 3 generations, even more in some countries of Muslim presence in the West, that there is a lack of such a vision for the future? Is that the transnational dimension of our presence and the vision that we are here, but we're also connected to what is happening in southern countries, in Muslim majority countries. Do you think that this is somewhere here in the Muslim awareness and the wisdom of conscience?
So. I'm less pessimistic than many Muslims are. I think our demands are very high. We want unity when we actually mean and we want to be unanimously. That's never going to happen. But if you look, give you a very simple example, and I'll finish this very quickly, is this, that you go anywhere in the United States, and you look at the narrative of the Palestinian conflict, you'll get the Zionist version. You get anywhere in the Muslim world, you'll get an anti-Zionist version, more or less, part of the common sense.
The Palestinian conflict the easiest one to get unity?
But I think that's a metaphor. Why should people in Indonesia care about what's happening in Gaza? I mean, realistically. But they do.
Just showing something, yes.
Palestine is a metaphor for the Muslim condition. And that's how Muslims understand it. And I think that is a connection. If you can read yourself, regardless of where you are, through that, then I think it tells you something about yourself.
Thank you so much for your remark. I think that during this discussion we have been first able to say that, or at least to assess the situation, understanding that what is happening in the West is not only because of the Muslim presence, it's beyond that. It's something which has to do with an identity crisis within the West and its place in the world today, the economic order, the political power. This is a revealing process with the Muslims being there and being involved in all this discussion. Something that you said which is important is that for the Muslims to be able to look at themselves, their tradition, where they are coming from, all the values that they are respecting, and also to be able, beyond the national discussions, to look beyond that and to understand that it's a transnational phenomenon which has to do with the West, but also beyond the West, with Muslim majority countries, and this is where it's important for the Muslim conscience. And you ended with something which is a more optimistic take, is that something is happening, and it's not just now that we can see it, it's a historical process for now and for the future. That's all we have time for. Please let us know your thoughts and views on any of the shows you have seen, and here is the way to contact us.
We'd like to hear your views on today's show, as well as ideas for future programmes. You can do this by emailing us at islamandlife@presstv.co.uk. You can also join our Facebook page by searching Islam and Life on Press TV, where you can view past programmes, keep up to date on future shows, leave comments and meet other Islam and Life fans.
Finally, I would like to thank my guest, Dr. Salman Sayed. Thank you so much for your input and your views, and I hope to see you next week, inshallah.